Welcome to So and So, brought to you by Bernina, Made to Create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Michelle Renee Hiatt, Executive Show Director at the American Quilter Society. Michelle was born in South Jersey, New Jersey, and raised by a single mom and grandmother. A middle child with 4 siblings, she attended the Rutgers School of Business, majoring in accounting and marketing, following that with a master's degree in technology from the same institution. Earning her Six Sigma Master Black Belt, Michelle spent the first 30 years of her career overseeing process improvement and operations for large companies, such as Trump Casinos, Elsevier, Dow Jones, and Moody's, and consulted for technology firms and New York University. While working full-time, she began designing and teaching quilting. She created her own pattern line and taught throughout the USA at quilt shows, retreats, cruises, quilt shops, and guilds. In 2023, Michelle became the Executive Show Director for the American Quilter Society. She currently lives in Paducah, Kentucky, with her husband and 2 German shepherds, and in her spare time, Michelle enjoys quilting, gardening, and traveling, with a future trip to Alaska coming up. Hi, Michelle, and welcome to So and So.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It is good to hear your voice again. We got to meet last year at Quilt Week in April of 2024 when you were really new at being a part of the show, and it was kind of a fire hose session for you. But we'll be really interested in learning how things are going and talking about how you got to where you are. So we mentioned that you started sewing as a child. You watched your grandmother, and she was a seamstress. She made custom draperies, and she taught you crewel applique, crocheting, cross stitching, and quilting. What sparked this interest for you, Michelle?
I think first and foremost was probably just having that one-on-one time with my Oma. That being one of 5, and being raised by my mom and my grandmother, it was you know uh, it was hard to get one-on-one time. So my grandmother just loved anything with a needle, and she always inspired that outlet to use sewing to create and to bring that extra something, color, design, texture, whatever it was to your life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was, we used her scraps. The first quilting I learned was more crazy quilting, is what they
Mm-hmm.
call it now. Making crazy quilt blocks, but just using up the spare trimmings and fabric that she had, um, and then also making clothes, making sweaters, scarves, things that weren't as easy for us at that time to purchase, but we could make them. I think most importantly was having that time to spend with her.
Do you remember the first thing you made?
I believe it was a pot holder.
Perfect. Perfect.
Crocheting a pot holder, and I was,
Sure.
I'm born left-handed, I'm pretty ambidextrous, but, she was right-handed, so, sitting opposite her and trying to mimic and mirror her movements, so I didn't take to
Interesting.
knitting as well. It
Uh-huh.
wasn't, I either had tension problems. I was either too stressed about it
Uh-huh.
or the complete opposite, so, my knitting is not as good as my crocheting, so.
Now you mentioned that you were raised by a single mom and your grandmother. What influence do you think this had on your life overall?
Well, I'm probably a little bit more straightforward than many people can appreciate or would appreciate. They were both very strong women. We called her Oma, so my grandmother came from Germany, and so she was, very strong. Um, she had a lot of hardships growing up, through the depression and such, and so I think she really one taught me, to have art as an outlet to get you through those times.
Hmm.
But two, to, always show up. My mother was very strong in pushing me towards education and always being able to take care of myself. I think based on her circumstances, she had to go back to college at night after my parents were divorced. So she was very much pushed me to make sure I was educated and always was respectful, but gave my opinion and stood up for myself. So I think they made me the strong woman I am today.
And obviously, with your education, with the background in accounting, marketing, technology, as I was preparing for this, I thought, what perfect skills for what you do today.
Hmm.
But I'd like to talk about the first 30 years of your career when you were executing process improvement projects for some pretty notable companies. So let me ask what drew you to this line of work, and can you share some of the projects you led?
Sure. Um, so it was actually by happenstance when I graduated college in '91 with my bachelor's degree. Uh, the economy had sort of a recession. It wasn't anything that near what we've experienced recently, but it was very hard to get into the accounting field. I had worked through college in the casino industry, and so I had a pretty decent position at that point. But of course, my mother didn't want me working in a casino after graduating with this,
Sure.
accounting and marketing degree. And why couldn't I put it to something else? So my mentor actually approached me in the casinos and asked me to apply for a management internship program that was being run by the Trump casinos at that time. This is before The Apprentice television show.
Hmm.
This is where it all started. So I applied for it. You had to have a certain GPA. You had to be willing to go back for your master's degree. And it was a 2-year program where we spent 2 weeks in every department throughout the casino and hotel to understand how it all came together. So that in order to do process improvement, you really need to understand the end-to-end process. So that if you were trying to fix a certain part of the process, you would understand how that impacted the other parts of the process and you could implement change across the board. Um, and so that's how I got started. I applied for the program, I was accepted. I suffered through the 2 years of working in all the different departments. Room service and the front desk were the worst, of the departments. Um, but then I went on and I applied for a full-time position in operational excellence, which is what oversees, at that time in the casinos, how everything, worked, policies, procedures, regulatory. So I was involved in, bringing simulcasting
Hmm.
Keno and poker to Atlantic City as far as writing the regulations and working with the Division of Gaming Enforcement. One of the most notable projects I worked on there was we brought serial numbered dice to the craps tables. Prior to that, they weren't numbered. So now, you ever go to the casino and you see the stick guy bring back the dice and flip them, he's checking for the serial numbers. It sounds like a really simple process, but it really isn't because dice are weighed, and actually in the casino industry, they're kept even more secure than cash because they have to be make sure that they're balanced and such, and that they can't be messed with because, of course, that could impact how the game works. So
Hmm.
from there, I went to open up Mohegan Sun up in Uncasville, Connecticut, and then I decided to leave after 12 years the casino industry, much to the delight of my mother, um, who thought this entire time I was just playing. And so I went to work on, in Wall Street down in Manhattan, and, yeah, I worked a part of for Reed Elsevier. I took them through I was there for 8 years. We started off with 42 publications and 42 websites, and at that time, I'm dating myself, but websites were really something new, and we expanded to 110, over those 8 years, um, bringing in and buying up, other companies. And so my job was to merge them into our organization. So from the due diligence to understanding what their systems and processes were, to understanding if we would migrate them to our systems or their systems were better and we'd migrate our entire organization to theirs, and took them through the Y2K projects and all of that. So really just understanding, the end-to-end impacts, improvements, and such. And then I went on to work at Moody's during another recession. Process improvement people are always busy during recessions.
Mhm.
Um, and so there I got to deal with economists who are some of the toughest people in the world to deal with, I will tell you. Um, and so Moody's had bought up 72 small rating organizations and we merged them onto five different systems. So that was pretty interesting. Most recently, prior to taking a full time position with AQS, I was with NYU, New York University, and I actually just happened to be on, we'll talk about this probably later, but how I was teaching and quilting full time and then consulting part time. But as it turns out, at the beginning of the pandemic, I had just wrapped up my winter consultancy with NYU, and they asked me to stay on to help them with COVID. So we had to get 60,000 students home based in 2 weeks' time and with online learning. And once we achieved that, then they asked me to stay on and manage the project of, okay, now how do we get the students back for the fall of 2020? And everybody thought we were definitely crazy and thinking that we could do it. We were hoping to have 5,000 students return to in person learning that fall of 2020, and we ended up getting 11,000 back. So managing that project, all the different caveats with, you know, different regulations coming down every day. We realized once we got them back that now we had to figure out how to COVID test them weekly, and where were we going to get the COVID test and all. So I learned a great deal during the pandemic and working with NYU. So I would say that's probably the most interesting part of the 30 years of my career is that just meeting so many people and working with the people who actually do the processes. So that was always in process improvement. You go to the Gemba, it's part of Six Sigma, the source of the truth. And so working with people who just really enjoyed what they did and were happy to help you understand what they did, and then you could connect the dots for them and help them all work together to improve it. But that's basically my role.
I'm struck, Michelle, by the fact of the work that you did was in such heavily regulated industries,
Mm,
h
very much.
high pressure, and it must have been a whirlwind of 30 years, and yet during that time and you mentioned this when you were talking about NYU, you found the time to design and teach quilting, create your own pattern line, and then begin teaching. You were teaching at quilt shows, retreats, cruises, quilt shops, guilds. So I don't know if there were enough hours in the day, but obviously there were. So talk about what fueled this passion for you and how you were able to make all of this happen.
Well, I think it started really with, I've always been a quilter, but when I was working for Reed Elsevier, I actually, in those 8 years, I actually moved 8 times.
Mm,
And my grandmother said, you should go to the local quilt shops and get to know folks. That's a great way to meet people. And when you're in process improvement, you are often called on to evaluate your colleague's department. So it's not really easy to make friends so much at work. So meeting people at quilt shops and blocks of the month and things like that was really a great source for me.
mhm,
So I always leaned into quilting during my career as one to meet people and two for stress relief. So I happened to be working at Seven World Trade on 9/11, and so that's really when I made a major investment of my personal time into quilting. It was my therapy after the event.
mhm,
So I was relocated to Chicago and worked out of that office. And I came upon these Friday night shows at these local quilt shops. And, you know, as quilters are, those women didn't care if I talked or I didn't talk.
mhm,
They were just there to support me and whatever I was going through. And, I still talk to those women to this day. We've been through, loss of spouses and cancer and loss of children and the birth of children and such. So I think quilting really just brings people together. But it was upon another move, shortly after Chicago, I was moved, transferred to the Philadelphia office, and I went to the local quilt stores to find out if they had a Friday night sew because I had just become so in. It really saved me, these Friday night
Mm-hmm.
sews
Mm-hmm.
that I went to in Chicago, and they thought I was nuts. So I formed my own Friday night sewing group. Went to a local hotel that really did business travel, and I asked them what they did with those meeting rooms on the weekend, on Friday nights and Saturday, and they said they go empty. I negotiated a good rate for them, and I told went back to my block of the month ladies, and I said, "Hey, if each of you are willing to chip in $10, we can rent this room for Friday night, and I'll get together and sew." And they still meet in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It's called the
Hmm.
Fun Quilt Club, the Friday Night Quilt Club. But it was there that I found myself on Friday night walking around telling them all how they could do things better or more easier with quilting.
You were
And they told
improving their
me
processes.
exactly. And they said, Michelle, you should really teach. And I was like, I never thought about that. So
Uh-huh.
I had no spare time at all, but I got relocated to Jersey. I was back in Manhattan. And I went into the local store, Pennington Quilt Works, there in New Jersey, and I asked, would they consider letting me teach? And I showed her a couple of my designs and my patterns. And Jan was like, "Oh, these are great." She goes, "These are extremely well written. You should consider publishing these."
Mm-hmm.
Um, she goes, "It must be your process background that has made these instructions really easy to follow, but they're amongst the best patterns I've ever seen written." So it was really upon her pushing and my Friday night group pushing me. But eventually I started teaching. I would do it on weekends and during vacation time. Um, and I had entered a quilt in American Quilter Society, and I got approached about considering doing a lecture for them. And then I started teaching for them. And so it just began, and I was asked to teach on cruises. In 2015, I left my full time job um, and, and changed it to where I was teaching quilting full time. And I was consulting during the winter months when you're not hired as much.
Mm-hmm.
So I would typically pick up a consulting job from October to February, and then I would teach quilting the rest of the year. So my husband, I don't know how I convinced him, but he was willing to let me make the jump. But I left a full-time VP position to teach quilting.
You
So
know, all arrows pointed toward this, though.
it did. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, and then I was fortunate enough in 2023 to be able to merge both my corporate career experience with my love of quilting. So to have a full-time position in quilting is rare. So I love it.
So I want to get into what happened in 2023 that is affecting everything now. But first, I have to ask: do you have a Friday night sew group in Paducah?
I don't yet. No, I've only been here for about 12 weeks. So I moved just before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a little bit of a whirlwind. I haven't started one yet, but I've started to put out feelers about, the local guilds here and such. So
It'll
yeah,
happen
it
for
will.
sure.
I've been
So,
trying to talk I have a group of very talented young ladies who work for me here. And I'm, of course, working on convincing them all to become quilters. So some are, but some aren't. So I'm trying to put together even maybe an employee sewing event.
we're going to check back in with you in about a year, probably in April, actually, in Paducah, and see if this hasn't happened already. So,
Yeah, there we go.
um, in 2023, you became the executive show director for AQS, and you followed in the footsteps of Bonnie Browning, who retired at that time, and she had held that position for 40 years. So you had quite a legacy to come in after.
Yes.
Tell us this story, Michelle. How did that happen?
So it's pretty funny. When I started teaching for AQS back in I think 2012 was my first time I taught for them. Um, I think it was either that first time or the second time. There's a gentleman, Terry Quill, who we instructors call him the teacher wrangler, but he's actually the COO of American Quilter Society, but he always manned the teachers' room. And so he got wind of what I did in my full-time job, and he asked me a lot of questions about it. And so I had shared with him that, at the end of, each of the projects I work on, we do a lessons learned. And him and I would jokingly, at the end of each of my teaching engagements, we would do a lessons learned for that AQS quilt week. And so some of the stuff that I suggested to them, they put into place, just such as giving maps to the instructors, that would make it easier and such. But anyhow, I enjoyed my time tremendously with it. So I guess I was actually teaching in on a quilting cruise in 2022, was it?
Hmm.
Must have been. Anyhow, and I get off at this port, and I have this message from Bill Schrader. So I'm like, "Oh, something must have happened." I was scheduled to teach in Paducah in 23, and I was just like, "Oh, they must have overhired teachers or something." I couldn't figure out why Bill was calling me. So I returned the call, I got his voicemail, and then I texted Terry because I was like, "Hey, what's going on? I got this message from Bill." And he's like, "Oh, you need to talk to him." So apparently Terry had shared with him that not only was I this quilt instructor that they all knew, but that I did this process improvement and that I was still consulting and such. So they asked me to take an interview, and the rest is history. I was fortunate enough to get offered the position, and it's been very exciting.
And we actually spoke in an episode that was focused on Quilt Week last April, and you, along with Bonnie Browning, kind of talked about the transition. Um, Tell us about your role today and what's involved, because there is people know Quilt Week in Paducah, but there are myriad shows and a lot of things you do. So talk to us about what you do.
Sure. So, I mean, it's of course event planning of the 5 shows. So we do put on 5 shows each year. They are, for this year, they're in Daytona, Branson, our main Paducah show, Grand Rapids, and Lancaster. Um, But we're also adding, seam retreats, so that shared experiences amongst members. So for years, I've taught at retreats and quilting cruises and know that, those are events that quilters also like. So we've determined that let's add them to our events that we run each year. So we have a quilting retreat that will take place here in Paducah in October, for 2 weeks with 5 different instructors each week.
Mm,
So we've added that, and then we have our first quilting cruise coming up in a couple weeks to the Panama Canal, and we've just released that next year we're doing Hawaii on our quilting cruise. But so it's the organizing of all of that from an education standpoint, then the quilt contest that we have, vendors managing the vendors. But I have a beautiful team here of people who help with a lot of those details as well. But it is, it's like herding cats in that. But I enjoy it thoroughly. I really enjoy being a part of making sure that quilting carries on to our next generation,
mhm,
that it's here. So it's really interesting being, a part of seeing what's trending, what's next, how do we get that next generation involved, what new techniques are on the rise, what instructors
mhm.
are up and coming that people want to hear from and learn from. So it's very exciting, but it's a lot to manage, but I think my experience in the past has helped me greatly with that.
Indeed, herding cats. I like
Yes.
that. So you mentioned getting the next generation involved, and I know that is an awareness throughout the industry, that needs to be something to be focused on. Anything specific that you can talk about, Michelle, that you see as something that can be put into place to help the next generation become involved?
Well, I think, we have to pay attention to, I don't think it would surprise anyone. I don't think I'm insulting anyone by saying this, but that next generation, their attention span is much less than ours.
Mhm.
They look for quick results. They get most of what they're learning from online. Although it does seem they do appreciate meeting those people in person as well and learning from them directly. But I think it's introducing small, affordable um, projects that can be completed pretty quickly, or we're definitely focusing on more of technique classes. So let them interpret it and use it for what they want. They really just want to learn the technique, and then they tend to be more entrepreneurial than prior generations. So I think
Mm,
in that same spirit, they like to learn the technique and do what they want with it.
mhm.
So we're definitely focusing on having those technique classes or those quick projects. We have the Cabana Creativity Challenge that we did this year, which is just a 7-inch square of a wool project, and start with you know your dream cabana, what that would look like, and you could do anything with it, whether or not it was handwork or machine work. But you had to use this little 2-inch cabana in this 7-inch square, and we actually juried them yesterday, and it's pretty exciting
Mhm.
to see what people came up with. But so we were trying to do things that are those quicker projects that don't just include quilting, maybe include other stitching work as well with it.
Will, the results of that contest be available online on your website?
It's actually gonna be at our show. So,
Okay.
we have, over 70 of them coming, with us, and they'll be at all 5 of our shows, this coming year in 2025. So there'll be a specific display, at the show, and we're gonna let those that attend the show do a viewer's choice, pick their favorite cabana that's been submitted to us.
So in your early, your first several months in the role that you have now, any surprises?
Not really. I I mean, I have a wonderful team. I shadowed Bonnie for 9 months. So I think that I was prepared for what I saw. I mean, my blessing is that it's as fabulous as I expected it to be.
Mhm,
So the people enjoying the work, um, just dealing with quilters and the quilt instructors and the staff, of course. But I would say that you never know when you're changing. We were living in the Northeast, and to move to Kentucky. So I guess probably would be on a personal note. My biggest was surprise was how well my husband has taken to the move to Kentucky.
that's a nice surprise.
So, that was my biggest worriment. I knew
Sure.
that I loved it, and I was, coming a week, month for the last, 18 months before making the move. So I knew that I would enjoy it, and that, I was really getting the benefit of having my dream job. And so, it was a lot for me to ask. So, I'm thrilled that he loves it. Yeah, and the dogs are fitting in great too. They love it too.
That helps too. So under your leadership as executive show director, what do we have to look forward to? Are there any changes or things that people will be able to take note of since your arrival?
I would say definitely the addition of our events. So bringing that quilting cruise and the seam retreats. As a quilt instructor, I knew that we instructors love teaching at the 4-day events because they get to see the quilter through fruition. Um, from teaching them the technique to almost completing the project, and that the quilters love it because it becomes something that they bond and you know, create a new community, new friends. Typically, those events afford a quilter maybe to travel where they couldn't before because they may have been widowed, or they were just afraid to travel on their own. Here, it gave them an opportunity to roommate with someone and be able to go places maybe they weren't necessarily willing to try on their own, or didn't know somebody. This put them with other people who love quilting.
Mhm.
So adding those events. So we have one new quilt retreat for 2025. It's in the fall, in October here in Paducah. That's also, I'd love for people to see Paducah when it's not Quilt Week. When there's not 34,000 people here. Paducah is a fabulous artsy town. and it has a lot to offer. So we're adding that, and then the quilting cruise. We hope to add additional quilt retreats in the future years. We're seeing how the 2025 goes first.
I do want to underscore your comment about Paducah. Very artsy town, very quaint and comfortable, and amazing restaurants. Um,
Totally.
yes.
Yes.
So visit anytime. And of course, the National Quilt Museum is there. So,
Yes, and so we're merging that. So we're trying to make the Seam Quilt Retreat, experience Paducah. So they arrive on a Tuesday. We have the ambassadors who are going to do a mural walk. For those of you who don't know, there's the river, the flood walls are painted with murals, and we have these lovely city ambassadors who are willing to explain and talk about them. Then we are doing a welcome event at the museum, so it's a private event where we'll have catered hors d'oeuvres, and we may have some special guests
mhm.
that they might be able to meet at the museum. And then we immerse into 4 days of classes on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And we have left a couple evenings, to your point, Meg, for them to experience the downtown and the
Mhm.
restaurants and such. We do have a Thursday night event where we're shuttling everyone over to Hancock's, and they'll have full run and a discount at Hancock's in
Mhm.
the evening. And then we have a farewell event on Saturday night where we have a bit of show and tell and a fabulous dessert bar. And then everybody will go on their way on Sunday. But we have 5 instructors for each week. And it's a 4 day class where it's not something that they're going to learn half, put it in a box, and head home. Hopefully, most of them will be able to complete the majority of their projects while they're here.
Sounds wonderful. And one other designation for Paducah is it has a UNESCO relationship.
Yes.
Absolutely, not only for the event, but for the town of Paducah itself, certainly worth a visit. So, I want to talk about your involvement with the Sew on the Go pattern line and the fact that you're a certified instructor for Studio 180 design.
hmm
Tell us about these.
So that's what so on the go is my personal pattern line that I developed over 12 years ago, and so that's what I publish my patterns to. Although I'm publishing less patterns now that I'm working full time for AQS,
Hmm.
um, but I still have a couple a year that I'm producing. But so that's been my pattern line. I tried to put in place, my experience with process and writing instructions with my love of quilting and produced a pattern that I'm proud of. My thought is that while I'd love for you to take a class with me to learn that pattern, that quilt, if I'm selling a pattern, you should be able to make that quilt if you have the right skill set
Hmm.
um, with that, instructions. The Studio 180, with my process background, it's always can you produce a repeatable process that is consistent and has low errors? And when I met Deb Tucker back in 2008 at Quilt Market, she was demonstrating her rulers at the time. And I am not a paper piecer. There's nothing wrong with it. If I can figure out a way to make a unit with a ruler instead, that's my preference. And so she has designed a set of rulers for every shape that I don't know if you remember her, but Doreen Speckman
Hmm.
produced a book back in the day, The Fundamentals of Quilting. And she said, if you can learn to make these shapes, you basically can make any quilt. And so Deb Tucker, who's behind the Studio 180 line, she has developed a tool or a tool plus a technique sheet that would get you all those shapes that Doreen Speckman said that you need to master to make quilts. Um, and so I love them. They work. I feel like they streamline the process. She has figured out where you can slightly oversize and where you need to precision cut, and her rulers call out where, to make that precision cut, or if you do oversize, how to trim it down to the exact size it needs to be. So I love them. They work. So I became certified, I think, in 2013 with them, and then have kept up my certification with them, and I use all her rulers in my patterns. So because they work, and I I I like the result, and I think that my students have a great high rate of success, and they finish their projects, which to me is the biggest compliment when they
Hmm.
actually finish that quilt as opposed to putting it in a UFO box.
Now, in addition to all of this, as if there isn't enough time, twice a year, you present what is called the highly anticipated online Mystery Quilt series, and it's intended to keeping quilters engaged and guessing. What
hmm
is this?
I found, we talked earlier about my quilting as my therapy, and I found if you can get yourself behind that sewing machine. One, getting behind that sewing machine is the toughest part, but if you can get yourself there, it's the best therapy for you from a mental standpoint.
Hmm.
And so I designed, I first did it as just on a whim. Let me try and put together this quilt series that would engage people and get them sewing 3 hours a week. As a person who was working full time myself at the time, I felt that 3 hours was fair. It would give me enough, um, to keep me, coming back, and if I knew a new clue was releasing next week, I'd be more likely to actually complete
Hmm.
the clue. I also, thought that often quilters see a quilt and it looks extremely complex, and they're not willing to try it. But if they, 1, don't know what they're making, and 2, I put it in digestible bites that they can achieve little by little and build on that skill. So start off with basic units and build on that to give them more intricate units that they might try it. And it's been a huge success. So now, I run one January. There's one starting in a couple weeks, January to May, and then I do another one July to December.
Hmm.
And they're usually 16 weeks, and they have 4 buys them. So they actually run 20 weeks, but they get a break every 4 weeks. They get a week off to catch up because we're human. Um, and so during the pandemic, I changed them from just being written instructions, which are called clues, um, to an online series. So they get every week I release the instructions, and then I produce step by step videos that they can either fast forward through if they know it, or they can watch it. It's probably my one of the things that I have been able to keep up with doing my full time job.
And it sounds like you really enjoy this
Oh, I
quite a
love
bit.
it. Yeah, yeah.
Michelle, how can people find out more about this?
They can, for my mysteries, they can go to my website, which is sewonthego.net. And from there, they just follow the links to the current mysteries. They can also, even though they're revealed, they can actually purchase memberships to the prior mysteries as
Hmm.
well. Because if I were to change it to a pattern from a mystery, I usually wait 4 or 5 years before I would do so.
Okay.
Um, yep.
Michelle, what's next for you and what's your dream?
Well, I like I said earlier, I feel like I'm living my dream job now. So I'm able to merge my, what I've been educated in and worked in my professional career with my love of quilting, and to be a part of what's happening in quilting, and hopefully steering to what's next in quilting.
Hmm.
And I'm able to still, travel with my husband at times, and plus travel throughout the country still with the AQS shows and the retreats and cruises that we do. So I get to spend time with quilters every day and be a part of quilting. So I love it. If anything, it would just be expanding the different events that we do here at AQS.
We covered a lot of ground today. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
No, I think everything's been covered. I mean, I think what I really try and stress here at AQS is that I'm a quilter. First and foremost, I'm a quilter. That really helps because I'm one of them. I'm one of the people who are members. And then, I've been one of the instructors as well. I still, try and pick up not at Paducah Quilt Week, but at the other quilt weeks, I still do have a lecture or teach. So I'm still very much involved in the teaching aspect too. I think that's really important um, for myself as well as for my position here is to
Hmm.
be interacting with quilters on many different levels, from my position as the executive show director, but also as an instructor and then as a quilter to have ears on the ground.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned before your website, so let's do this one more time. If our
Sure.
listeners would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, for anything relating to AQS, is of course come through our AQS AmericanQuilter.com website. You can connect with me there. And if it's for my personal patterns or mysteries, they can reach me through sewonthego.net.
Michelle, it has been wonderful to talk to you today, to catch up, to learn more. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled.
Well, there you have it, another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing and quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life, it's a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.